Let's talk about using a Portastudio to sync multiple pocket operators and or Korg Volcas. As you can see, I've been hoovering up these relatively inexpensive little synthesizers like a magpie with an eBay account. But honestly, I've barely got around to using them. Since I'm trying to introduce some creative content and some general content alongside the repair and teardown videos that I usually do, I thought I'd challenge myself to write an electronica track using the Portastudio with some of these devices. So right now I'm in the middle of filming that process. I had a good idea of how that was going to work, namely that I was going to take the sync out from one of these devices and record it to track 4 of the Portastudio, and then use this sync facility that some Portastudios, including this 414, have to send that sync signal out of the sync out, and use this to trigger off the correct tempo in these devices. But I hadn't actually done it before, and I hit a few snags that I didn't expect to. Namely that the signal that comes out of the sync out isn't actually loud enough for what some of these devices require. And so if you're going to do that, you need to find some way to boost that signal. I thought it would be good to dedicate a video to this part of the process and guide folks through the potential pitfalls and the workarounds that I've found. Before we get into that, if it's not already obvious to you why we might want to synchronize a Portastudio with these devices, let's discuss that. Suppose you, like me, have 2 or more pocket operators or vocals or some combination of both. You don't have a digital audio workstation, or you don't want to use it, and you don't have a hardware sequencer like the Arturia Beatstep, but you want to write a long song. These units all have onboard sequencers, but there's a limit to the number of patterns that you can chain together. 16 patterns in some cases, so not that great for long songs. Striping the cassette with the sync information means that you can string together 16 patterns from one of these devices, record it onto tape, and then program 16 more. Record that immediately afterward using the sync information that you already striped to track 4 to ensure that the tempo on preceding and subsequent takes match. On a more sophisticated Portastudio like 44 Mark III, for instance, 464 would be another example, where you have a digitally controlled transport and you have punch-in facilities. You could do that on one track. In the past, what I've done, and I'm thinking specifically of a comedy cover I did of My Sharona using the PO32 as my drum machine. I did the first 16 bars on one track, then the next 16 bars on the second track. In that case, I was just setting them off manually rather than using the sync information. And then later on, I bounced those mono drum tracks onto one track, leaving me the remaining ones so I could do more stuff in the Portastudio. I'll leave a link to that video in the description of this one. Other thing that's going to be advantageous about the process that I'm about to demonstrate is, although you can, just taking the pocket operators on their own for a minute, chain these together so you get these 3.5mm stereo jack cables. And from left to right, say I was going to chain these 3, you would need 2 cables like that. And then the audio from all 3 would come out of the speaker of the third one, the last one in the chain. The trouble with doing that is that setting the relative levels can be pretty tricky. And if you try and adjust the balance between the levels of the chained pocket operators while you're playing back, it starts to go foobar. And of course, you can't change the equalization. There's no EQ facility when you chain these up. Whereas if you use sync information to ensure that they're all at the same speed and you overdub them onto adjacent tracks, then you can fiddle with the balance and the EQ after the fact. Let's imagine another scenario where you'd have something like a Beatstep Pro and an external mixer, and so you're using the Arturia to keep all of these sorts of devices in sync with each other, and you're using the mixer to combine and EQ the audio output. That's pretty good, but one of the ways that you're going to get the most out of these things sonically is the facility you have to turn the dials and alter the sound as you go along. All of these units have some sort of facility to record that, albeit at a per bar level, which can make the repetition in your music a bit more obvious. However, even if you've got lightning hands and incredible concentration, there's only the 2 hands to work. You've only got one mind, and trying to simultaneously tweak all the knobs on a very complex system is going to be pretty difficult. By contrast, if you build up your track with overdubs, you can treat the tracking of each Volca or pocket operator as a dedicated live performance. Let's imagine you do have a Portastudio and some stuff like this, but you don't have a Beatstep. You would like a facility to mix and synchronize these live. The Portastudio can actually work in that way. You can bring the sound of the different units into the mixer whilst having a variable tempo control coming out of the synchronized track. And I guess the last reason you might want to combine these is just the way that a tape sounds. The characteristics of analog cassette can do something flattering to the sound of the Volcas and the pocket operators. I suppose if I had a criticism of the way some of these things sound, they can be a little cold, especially the ones that use digital synthesis. Recording these devices onto cassette can add a little bit of bandpass filtering, tape compression, change of the emphasis on the mid-range, all of which can warm and distress the sound in a pleasing way. In case anyone was curious, this is what the sync output from a Volca looks like. You can see it's 5 volt peak to peak. I would suggest that they're trying to create a square wave. Most oscillators can't produce a perfect square wave. You can see that the leading edge is pretty round, but I mean it does cut off very quickly. So those pulses are giving an indication of tempo. And then the reason that we would have a separate sync out on a Portastudio, you've got the option to have the output of that track of tape go straight to the back of the unit unmolested by your noise reduction or the changes in gain or in equalization, and therefore wave shape that passing through the mixer might cause, whilst using the other tracks with EQ, with noise reduction if you want. Because if you start to change the EQ or start to use a compander on that, which is really what DBX certainly on the Tetrakan Portastudios is, then you're going to start to change the amplitude of this square pulse relative to the noise floor. You're going to start to change the shape of that, because if you emphasize part of the harmonic series using equalization, then that's going to translate into a different shape on this, and it really needs something close to a square shape on this leftmost leading edge for the receiving unit to derive tempo information from this. Honestly, I'm making an educated guess about how this works based on, you know, my general knowledge of electronics, which as a non-engineer isn't going to be perfect. So by all means, if you're some sort of boffin and you want to clarify in the comments anything I've said, go ahead. But I think for musicians using this stuff, that's probably as good a technical understanding of what's happening as you need. I'm currently wiping over an old tape. I bought a job lot. Someone else has already recorded music on it. So I'm recording nothing onto tracks 1, 2 and 3, but in track 4 I'm recording the sync out from the Volca, so I'm striping the whole of this 90-minute tape, the 120 beats per minute, so I can start to do some experiments with making the sync out, control the tempo of all these devices. So let me demonstrate to you the snag that I hit that I was talking about in the intro to this video. This is roughly how I had things set up, i.e. I had striped my cassette with sync signal from the sync out. I had a signal going into the sync in on this Volca drum. When I pressed play, I could see that track 4 was flashing. I had DBX set to sync so that there was no noise suppression on track 4. But then I pressed play on the Volca and it's not producing any sound. I was beginning to think, well, maybe there's something wrong with the sync out socket. But when I plugged in my speakers, which are just off screen here, I don't want to turn this up too much in case I damage the speakers, but I hope you can hear a pop, 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 pop. So there's definitely a signal coming out of there. And clearly the Volca is registering that there is a sync input. Otherwise, it would just play back like that. I found that if I sent the output of this to the line out with fader all the way up above this greyed area, so it's actually adding some gain, and added a bit of low end to track 4, I could get that to work. That made me realise that the issue was that this just isn't loud enough. We could see when we were looking at the output of this on the oscilloscope that it was 5 volts peak to peak. There's no way that a cassette is going to spit out 5 volts. So what we've got to do in order to make this work is take that sync output and amplify it in some way. So I'll come back with my solution to that issue, although there's probably a range of things that we could do to solve that. So here's the solution I found. controlling the speed, whether it stops or starts, balance levels, EQ, everything from the Portastudio without really touching the Volca drum. And I'm, in my case, using this Joyo American sound. It's a preamp pedal that's meant to sound a bit like a Fender amp. I mean, it sounds good, whether it sounds exactly like a Fender amp or not. But if you've seen some more of my music videos, you've seen me use this quite a bit. But I'm really just using this to boost the signal. So the drive's pretty low, the level's up quite a bit. I find that the sync signal is quite sensitive to the low end. If you turn it up too much, it's weird. It starts interpreting 4-beat bars as two-step. But if it's too low, then when you've got this pitch control down here, then it doesn't read properly. So you've got to find a sweet spot with this, and I'm tending to leave the other EQ controls just kind of flat in the middle. But that makes all of that work. At some point in the future, I may try and capture a kind of live jam or something with several Volcas or several pocket operators or some combination thereof, using the Portastudio as the master controller. There's probably some logistics to do with how the sync output is sent to more than one unit. That's for another time. Other little thing to note just before we close up the video is this whole business where we're kind of changing the tempo. If I were to record that, then I'm also going to be altering the pitch of the drums at the same time. So again, I'll probably do a separate video about that. I mean, it's going to be a pretty wacky effect, I think, but you'll have this thing where it gets higher pitched and slower, or like faster and lower in pitch. So maybe there's some kind of weird creative use for that. I might explore that at some point if somebody doesn't pit me to the post. Anyway, I hope that was helpful. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.